Jury selection for Karen Reid's second trial starts on April 1st, and enough new people are interested in this case that I thought it's time for a full recap of the chart. Unbelievably, this is not even close to everybody, and we are not going to get to all these people today. I'm just going to start talking about the main player, who they are, and how they're involved. And it all begins with these two. Karen Reid, who is accused of the murder of her Boston police officer boyfriend, John O'Keefe. Karen is accused of reversing into John with her Lexus SUV and then leaving him to die. Prosecutors claim that they can prove that Karen backed into John intentionally with her car going 24 miles an hour and then left him to pass away from a combination of blunt force trauma to the head and hypothermia. But Karen has long maintained that she was being framed by all of the people who were attending the party, as well as various investigators and police involved in this situation. She says she left John at a party at 34 Fairview Road in Canton, Massachusetts, and she didn't even know anything was wrong until the next morning when she woke up around 4 a.m. John passed away on January 29th of 2022, and the night before that, everybody was getting ready for a blizzard. At the morning of January 28th, Canton was preparing for a major snowstorm. There had already been a state of emergency declared. Just before 8 p.m. that evening, Karen got a text from John saying that he was going to go out to a bar. These two had been bickering via text message earlier in the day about a couple different things. Karen, I guess, had given John's kids donuts from Dunkin' Donuts for breakfast. He didn't like that. And also, she had a plumber over at her own property to fix her hot water heater. He was like, I could have fixed that myself. But regardless of that, they decide to meet up at the bar, and John even says that he expects her to stay the entire weekend at his house, because they do live separately, by the way. Two of them meet up around 9 o'clock at a bar called C.F. McCarthy. They have a couple drinks, and then within a couple hours, they decide to move on to the next bar, Waterfall Bar and Grill. And at Waterfall Bar and Grill, there are already a bunch of other people there that they know. Brian and Nicole Albert, who are the owners of 34 Fairview Road, are there, as well as their daughter Caitlin and Caitlin's boyfriend Tristan, who is a snowplow driver. Brian's brother, Chris Albert, is also there with his wife, Julie. Chris Albert is a selectman for the city of Canton. Also at the bar is Nicole's sister, Jen McCabe, and Jen's husband, Matt McCabe. So all of these people in this row right here are in-laws with each other. And like John, Brian Albert is also a Boston police officer. Also at the bar is Brian Higgins, who is an ATF agent. Previous to all of this, Brian Higgins and Karen Reid had been sending flirtatious text messages to each other while Karen has been dating John. And at one point, they exchanged a kiss that they both described as a peck. When Karen and John arrived at Waterfall Bar and Grill, they did not acknowledge Brian Higgins, and he sent a text to Karen saying, well, and still got no response from her. The reason Higgins was out with everybody is because earlier in the evening, Brian Higgins and Brian Albert had gone to New York for a funeral of another police officer. Also at that funeral was Kevin Albert. They all drove back together with another police officer named Eddie Hernandez. Hernandez is a Boston police officer, so they dropped him and Brian Albert off at the Boston Police Department so they could pick up their cars. Then they dropped Kevin Albert off at the Canton Police Department where his car was parked. And Kevin and Eddie did not join them at Waterfall Bar and Grill, but the rest of these people were there. Now, like I said, there's supposed to be a big snowstorm coming this evening, but it wasn't supposed to start until about 3 o'clock in the morning, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. The heaviest snow was going to fall. So Tristan was scheduled to start a snowplow shift around 3 o'clock in the morning, so he headed out from Waterfall Bar and Grill to go home and go to sleep. Also, Julie Albert ended up having a headache, and she decided to go home early as well. Meanwhile, while all these people are out at the bar, Brian Albert's son, Brian Albert Jr., is having a birthday party at 34 Fairview. He had several friends over at the party, including Sarah Levinson and Julie Nagel, and also his cousin, Colin Albert, who is the son of Chris and Julie Albert. And they are just having a good time, having a party. Also at the house is the Alberts' German Shepherd, Chloe, who has previously bitten people. That will become relevant later. Around midnight, Julie Nagel texts her brother Ryan Nagel and asks him for a ride home. Also, Colin Albert texts his cousin-in-law, Allie McCabe, who is Jen and Matt McCabe's daughter, and asks her for a ride home. Colin and Allie have maintained that they left by 12:10 in the morning, but the only thing that corroborates this are screenshots that were provided by Allie and Colin, and they honestly look a little bit suspicious. They look edited to me. There has been a question for a long time over whether the texts were edited or not. But still, police made no effort to corroborate her story that she left with Colin at 12:10 in the morning. Around the same time that Colin and Allie are allegedly leaving 34 Fairview, most of the people that are out at Waterfall Bar and Grill decide to go over to 34 Fairview to continue the party, to continue drinking and having fun. Julie Albert, like I said, had already gone home, and Chris Albert decides to go home as well to meet her there. And at 12:11 a.m., John is seen on CCTV outside Waterfall Bar and Grill with a cocktail glass in his hand, heading out to a car. And yes, that means John fully walked out of a bar with a cocktail glass and just left, which is crazy because one time I was almost tackled to the ground for doing exactly that in Austin, Texas. Like I said, the snow wasn't really supposed to start getting heavy until about 3 o'clock in the morning. This image, taken less than a couple of miles from 34 Fairview Road, shows exactly how much snow was on the ground right around midnight. Here is another, a different CCTV camera showing the snow on the ground at that time. This is from right around 12:15 in the morning. Karen and John had never been over to Brian Albert's house before, so they actually overshot it and drove past. And John ended up calling Jen McCabe to get directions to Brian Albert's house. After a little bit of back and forth and driving around for a little bit, they finally end up at Brian Albert's house right around 12:21 in the morning. And Karen, who suffers from both multiple sclerosis as well as Crohn's disease, decided to stay in the car and said, John, can you go inside and make sure that this is the right house? The lights were off at the property. She wasn't really sure that they were truly invited because they weren't super close to these people. She says she sees John go up to the side door of the house, and then she waits. And she hears nothing from John. And she's pissed. She's like, you basically went into this house and immediately forgot about me. And she waits for a few minutes for him. He doesn't come out, and so she leaves. On her way home, she's trying to call him. She's leaving him a voicemail. And she ends up going over to John's house in Canton, Massachusetts, because that's where she planned on sleeping that night, and also because that's where John's kids are. After tragically losing his sister and brother-in-law, John had adopted his niece and nephew. And so there was a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old sitting in this house alone, and Karen's like, all right, I guess I'll go there. There's a voicemail recording of Karen walking into John's garage at 12:42 in the morning. And then she proceeds to leave him a lot of voicemails over the course of the evening. She's saying stuff like, I'm gonna leave your kids, I'm heading out. She's trying to bait him into answering her or coming home, but he will never talk to her again because he has already been fatally injured at this point. Now, the prosecution's version of events is that when leaving, Karen reversed her car 24 miles an hour, hit John, exploded her taillight into 47 pieces, launched John across the yard into Brian Albert's yard, and then left. And Karen is like, that is not what happened. We know because of Apple Health data on John's phone that his phone was moving around until about 12:35 in the morning. And his phone shows him going up and down 3 flights of stairs. Later, the prosecution would say that that was accounted for by going up and down hills in the neighborhood, but anyone with an iPhone can tell you that that isn't how it works. Sometime between 12:30 and 1 in the morning, Brian Higgins decides to go over to the Canton Police Department. Higgins is a federal agent, but he has an office at the Canton Police Department because one of his close friends is the chief of police, Chief Berkowitz. And Berkowitz had offered him office space at the Canton Police Department. So Higgins, after a night of drinking, drives over to the Canton Police Department, and he says it's to move his government vehicle. Now, I'll remind you, he was there just a few hours ago because he had been dropping off Kevin Albert at his vehicle, and he very well could have moved any cars that needed to be moved at that. Higgins testified he never called anybody that evening. But literally just a few months ago, we found out that Brian Higgins was on the phone with somebody at 1:30 in the morning at the Canton Police Department. We still don't know who, because before his phone could be preserved, Brian Higgins drove to a military base and threw away his phone and separately took out the SIM card and destroyed it. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. At some point, Ryan Nagel does show up to get Julie Nagel, but then Julie's like, just kidding, never mind, I don't actually want to leave anymore, and sends her brother home. My brother would lose his mind if I did that to him. Also, even though he is supposed to have a shift at 3 a.m., for some reason, Caitlin calls Tristan around like 1-ish in the morning and has him come pick her up. She doesn't want to be there anymore, I guess, so he comes and gets her. He says it's because she's high maintenance. A little while later, Jen would end up driving both Sarah and Julie home as well as Matt. And then this is in question. But it's possible that Jen searched how long to die in cold at 2:27 in the morning. The defense has an expert tech witness that says that they can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that she made that search at 2:27 in the morning. The prosecution says, no, she actually made that search at 6:30 in the morning. We're going to have to get more into those details in the second part of this, whatever this is. I don't have time for this right now. Meanwhile, during all of this, Brian Lucky Lochran, who is not related to any of these people, is preparing for his shift as a snowplow driver. He is assigned to the neighborhood where Brian Albert's house is. And he ends up passing Brian Albert's house at like 2:30, 3:30, 4:30, making multiple passes as the snow is continuing to fall and pile up. And he says he doesn't see any taillight pieces, he doesn't see a body in the snow, he doesn't see anything suspicious, and he says that he is trained to look for that stuff, and that there are massive floodlights on the front of his snowplow, and he would have seen something if it was there. At 2:22 in the morning, Brian Albert calls Brian Higgins. He says it's a butt dive. And then Brian Higgins calls Brian Albert back. He also says that this is a butt dial. I actually skipped over all of the times that Jen called John's phone and said that all of those were butt dials as well. There were at least 9 butt dials allegedly that evening. All of these people say that John never entered the house. So what the hell happened to John? Because when Karen woke up around 4:30 in the morning, he was not there. And she said that's when she knew something was wrong. That's everything I can fit in this part, so You'll have to just wait until the next one. I told you I couldn't fit it all into one. I'm sorry. Okay, love you guys. The complete Karen Read recap part 2. If you didn't see part 1, just go back one in the playlist. Karen Read woke up at 4:30 in the morning and realized that John O'Keefe never returned back to his house. And Karen is immediately upset. So she wakes up John O'Keefe's niece and she's like, have you heard from John? John's niece and nephew did testify during the first trial, but because they're minors, it was not televised. Like, it was not live streamed, the cameras were cut, and so was the audio. John O'Keefe's niece knew Jen McCabe and had previously hung out over at her house with her kids. So she called Jen McCabe and she's like, look, Karen Read's over here, she's frantic. And the niece ends up handing the phone to Karen Read so that Jen and Karen can talk. And the timeline here is a little bit confusing. Eventually, Karen decides to go over to Jen McCabe's house. But sometime before that, Karen Read calls, Carrie Roberts. Carrie Roberts has been friends with John since high school. And while Carrie wasn't out at the waterfall bar the night before, Karen thought maybe Carrie would know where John is. Carrie testified that when Karen called at first, the only thing she said was, John's dead, Carrie, Carrie, Carrie. And then Karen Read apparently hung up, and Carrie tried to call her back several times. Eventually, they got a hold of each other again, and allegedly Karen clarifies, I think John might have died. I think he may have been hit by a snowplow. Carrie says that Karen told her that she had checked John O'Keefe's niece's phone to see if John had called her, because Karen was like, he wouldn't leave his niece alone. He wouldn't have just left her here, so something must have happened, and she was very concerned. Frankly, at this point, a lot of the testimony becomes confusing and conflicting with each other, so you'll just have to bear with me as I explain what these people said. Carrie says that Karen told her she wasn't even supposed to sleep at John's house that evening, which is contradictory to the text messages between Karen and John that we've now seen, where he says, I expected you to sleep here until Monday. Carrie also testified that Karen said that they drank so much the night before that she didn't remember anything, and so Carrie discouraged Karen from driving around to look for John. Carrie was like, I will drive around and look for John myself. She says that Karen was like, absolutely not, I'm coming over to your house. So Carrie waited for her a bit at her house, then gets a hold of Karen, realizes she's actually over at Jen McCabe's house, and ultimately, Carrie, Karen, and Jen are over at Jen McCabe's house. Once the three of them are at Jen's house, Carrie says that she's like, are you sure you checked everywhere at John's house for John? Maybe he passed out behind a couch. Maybe you just didn't see it. So she suggests that they all drive back over to John O'Keefe's house. Carrie drives her car and Jen drives Karen's SUV. There is ring footage of them arriving at John O'Keefe's house. They basically get right out of the car and go into the house and start looking for John. Later, Carrie testified that Karen pointed out her cracked taillight. When Karen had initially left John O'Keefe's house to go to Jen McCabe's house, we have ring camera footage of her backing out of John O'Keefe's driveway and actually hitting John's Chevy Traverse with the back passenger side of her Lexus SUV. That becomes super important later because the corner with which she hit his SUV is allegedly also the corner the prosecution is saying that she killed John O'Keefe with. It is a massive question. Did the taillight break at this moment, or did the taillight break because she hit John O'Keefe with her car? So Carrie, Karen, and Jen are at John O'Keefe's house, and Carrie says that Karen points out the broken taillight. Carrie says that she's like, we don't have time for this, we gotta go look for John O'Keefe. The issue with that is that we have, again, the ring camera footage of them arriving at John O'Keefe's house. At no point in this clip does Karen Read show anybody the back of the car. And so Carrie testifies that upon seeing this footage, she realized that Karen must have actually showed her the taillight on the way out, not on the way in. After checking out John O'Keefe's house, they finally head over to 34 Fairview Road, which is the last place that anybody's actually seen John. At this point, there's about 4 or 5 inches of snow on the ground. Things are accumulating quickly. There's a lot of wind and visibility is not great. And right after 6 a.m., they arrive at Brian Albert's house, and from the back seat of the vehicle, Karen Read sees John O'Keefe in the snow. They had driven over in Carrie Roberts' vehicle, and Carrie testified that Karen was trying to kick her way out of the back seat because the doors automatically lock when you start driving. And when Karen gets out of the car and runs over, that's when everybody realizes that this is in fact John laying in the snow. He is unconscious and he is not breathing. The whole time all of this has been going on, Karen has been repeatedly calling John's phone. Karen called him around 50 times between the time she dropped him off at Brian Albert's house and the time that they actually found him. And during the last call, her phone actually connected to his phone and started leaving a voicemail. So Karen's phone, I believe, was inside Carrie Roberts' car, and she's outside the car. The doors are open, so we can hear some of the conversation. We can hear Karen Read screaming. Carrie Roberts is CPR certified because of her job, so she starts doing CPR on John O'Keefe and instructs Jen McCabe to call 911. We can hear part of the phone call of Jen McCabe calling 911 through Karen Read's voicemail. Karen is running around frantic. She is asking for blankets. Meanwhile, inside the house, Brian Albert, Nicole Albert, Brian Albert Jr., and Chloe, the German Shepherd, are all sleeping sound. Chloe is not reacting to any of this. There is no barking or anything. Right after Jen gets off the phone with 911, she calls Nicole Albert, her sister, 2 times. And y'all, she has just found a perhaps deceased person on her sister's front lawn. And Jen McCabe at no point decides to go up to the house, knock on the door, bash the door in, and make sure her sister is okay. Nor does anybody go up to the house to get blankets or anything like that, or to get Brian Albert, who is a Boston police officer and a first responder. Jen McCabe would later delete the phone calls to her sister and also literally every other phone call she made that morning. We have her phone records, and you can see how many calls she deleted first. On the stand, both Jen McCabe and Nicole Albert testified that they actually did not speak to each other, even though the call shows that it was answered for 7 seconds and 8 seconds. Coco is her sister, and you can see it says answered. Jen once again says, I didn't even intend to call her, those were butt dial. Just moments later, by around 6:10 a.m., Officer Steve Seraph arrives. He is a Canton police officer, and he is the one that was assigned to go figure out what happened with this call. And you can see there is very, very limited visibility. This is from his police cruiser, and there are I think that's Karen Reed and Jen McCabe. It might be Carrie Roberts, but the 3 of them were the only ones outside when he arrived. Again, Brian Albert and his family never came outside of the house. Over the next half an hour, a bunch more first responders arrived. Sergeant Sean Good was the shift supervisor at Canton PD that morning. Sergeant Michael Lank was also there. Eventually, they called in Lieutenant Paul Gallagher to help figure out crime scene preservation. We'll get to that. And then we've got 2 first responders that are important, Anthony Flametti and Katie McLaughlin. I believe they're both firefighter EMT. On the stand, both of these people testified that they heard Karen Reed say, I hit him. But it's really important to know that neither of them ever wrote that in any kind of report. Neither of them ever told a police officer or anybody. They never reported that to anybody until months and months after this death. And in court, it was revealed that Katie McLaughlin and Caitlin Albert she said they are not friends, but they were close enough that they had gone vacationing together before. Also, Anthony Flametti testified that when Karen Reed said, I hit him, it was when he was on the way to go treat John. He said he basically paused to stand and have a conversation with Karen Reed. The issue with that is, again, that's not on dash cam anywhere. And other EMTs have said that that would be a ridiculous thing to do. Your priority is not getting a story straight. Your priority is checking on the patient. Also, it would be extremely negligent to not note that you believed something was a motor vehicle collision in an EMT report upon handing a patient over to the hospital. And again, that never happened. Jen says around this point, her and Karen Reed are sitting in the back of a police cruiser, and Karen asks her, Google how long to die in cold. And that is Jen's excuse for why she has searched how long to die in cold. Jen would later delete that search. And this has become widely contested because some timestamps look like she actually made that search at 2:27 in the morning, which would have been well before she was aware that John O'Keefe was dead, unless she knew about John O'Keefe passing before Karen Reed ever knew about it. Simultaneously to all of this happening, Brian Higgins says that he gets a phone call from his buddy Kenneth Berkowitz, who at that time was the chief of police at Canton PD. Brian says he doesn't answer that phone call, and that the first person he speaks to that morning is Brian Albert. This is another weird timing thing, because Brian Higgins testified that he gets a phone call from Brian Albert at 7:20 in the morning, but then later he testifies that he arrives at Brian Albert's house at 7 that morning and leaves by 8. It is very confusing and nobody can get their story straight. In Massachusetts, when there's an unattended death, which means somebody died and nobody was there to know why, the protocol is that will be handled by the Massachusetts State Police. John O'Keefe was pronounced deceased before 7 a.m., and around that time is when Massachusetts State Police took over the investigation. First, Yuri Buchanan was notified, and then he notified Michael Proctor. Around the same time, Detective Lieutenant Brian Tully calls Chief Berkowitz at the Canton PD, and they decide that the Canton Police Department is recusing themselves from this case. It's not clear if that's just because of it being an unattended death, or if it's because of the massive amount of conflicts of interest to do with this case. Starting with the fact that Brian Higgins, who was there that evening, has an office at the Canton Police Department and is close personal friends with Kenneth Berkowitz. Or perhaps it's because Brian Albert, the homeowner, has a brother, Kevin Albert, who is a Canton police officer. Anyway, Michael Proctor ends up being assigned as the lead investigator of this case. But Michael Proctor actually has his own conflict. His sister, Courtney, is close friends with Julie Albert and Chris Albert, and Colin Albert, their son, was actually her ring bearer at her wedding. While all of this is going on behind the scenes, these people are still at the Alberts' house trying to secure the crime scene. And they decide the best way to do this is with a leaf blower. They walk around where John passed away, a 6 by 6 foot area, blowing away the snow with a leaf blower. And even though there's supposed to be 47 taillight pieces here, they do not find a single taillight piece, only the cocktail glass. This one here. They find a couple spots of blood in the snow as well, so they go to the neighbor's house, get some red Solo cups, and use them for evidence collection to scoop up some of this snow, before storing them in a Stop and Shop bag that is unsealed and untaped on the top. That's all I can fit in this part. I'm going to try to post the next part like very immediately after this. I will see you in just a sec. Love you guys. Drink the complete Karen Read recap part 3. I only posted part 2 about 10 minutes ago, so if you're seeing this out of order, you can just go back in the playlist. When we left off, the police officers were searching for evidence in the snow by using leaf blowers. At this point, several first responders have left the scene. This is around 7 a.m. John and Karen have both been taken to Good Samaritan Hospital, where John would be pronounced deceased at 7:50 a.m. and Karen was being held on what's called a Section 12. Both Karen and John were seen by Dr. Justin Wright, who was the doctor working in the ER at Good Samaritan that day. He said that when John arrived, his internal body temperature was 80 degrees. They did everything they could to save him, but he was not savable. I'm going to describe a little bit graphically how John looked when they found him, so scroll if you have to. But they said that there was blood coming out of his nose and mouth, and that there was like a goose egg laceration and a bump above his eye. His eye was very swollen. And also he was bleeding from the back of the head. Ultimately, that ended up being a skull fracture, which would later cause swelling to the brainstem, which would eventually shut down his respiration system. And because of the temperature, a neuropathologist later said that he would have been unable to seek help. The reason Karen had been brought to the hospital is because there were serious concerns about her mental health because of how frantic she was and upset. They ended up checking her blood alcohol level at the hospital, and at about 9 a.m. it was 0.09. Of course, the legal limit is 0.08, so she would have been under the influence of alcohol at that point still. During the trial, they did try to introduce testimony to show what Karen Read's blood alcohol level would have been between midnight and midnight 30. But they did have to clarify to the jury that you can't find somebody guilty of a DUI based on this retroactive blood alcohol level math. Karen has never said if she had any more alcohol after she got to John's house, and it's unclear if she was on any medication because of her multiple chronic illnesses that could have exacerbated or changed the way that she metabolizes alcohol. While all of this is going on, people are going over to Brian Albert's house. Brian Higgins got over to Brian Albert's house. It's confusing. Sometime between maybe 7 a.m. and 7:45 a.m. When he testified, he said he wasn't sure if there was still any police cruisers there. But we know that these officers didn't really leave until 7:30. And he also says that he didn't go over there until after he got a call from Brian Albert, and he didn't get a call from Brian Albert until 7:20. But he did testify on the stand that he got to Brian Albert's house between 7 and 7:15, and that he left by 8 a.m. Julie Albert says that she also went over to Brian Albert's house that morning, not because she knew anything about what was going on with John O'Keefe, but because she was bringing Brian Albert Jr. donuts for his birthday. She says that she brought donuts and she was going to leave them in Brian Albert Jr.'s car, and that while she was outside, Brian Albert Sr. came to the door and was like, "Hey, can you come in for a second?" Now, I find this quite interesting because that means he was able to hear Julie Albert pull up loud enough, I guess, to put donuts in Brian Albert Jr.'s car, but he didn't hear when Karen Read was outside screaming and these three were frantically running around trying to figure out what had happened to John. Anyway, so Brian Albert invites Julie Albert into the house. Julie Albert testified this was 8:30 a.m. She said 8:39 and then clarified 8:30. She says Brian Albert, Nicole Albert, Jen McCabe, and Matt McCabe were all in the house, as well as Brian Higgins, who had said that he was gone by then. It's confusing. But essentially, there is around an hour or so of time where all of these people are hanging out without any law enforcement there. Nobody has taken a statement from any of these people. And if they wanted to, that would have been a perfect opportunity to get their story straight. When she testified, Carrie Roberts said that she had never talked to Jen McCabe on the phone before. She said they had only really met one singular time, and that was when John took them to go buy Reeboks for the kids because he had a discount at the Reebok store. But because we have Jen's phone records, we know that she made multiple phone calls throughout the day to Carrie Roberts, including during that time where they were all at this kitchen meeting. She's talking to them, she's talking to Matt, she's talking to Brian Higgins, and she's calling Carrie Roberts repeatedly. At some point during this kitchen meeting, allegedly, Jen goes, "I heard Karen say, 'I hit him, I hit him.'" And she was encouraged to call Michael Lank back to the scene to let him know because it could be important information that Karen Read admitted to hitting him with her car. even if you're not a conspiracy theorist, reasonable doubt says that that could have been an opportunity where these people could have orchestrated a story and then fed that story to Michael Lang. But these people all testify that it's not a story, that is a fact, that John never came in the house. Meanwhile, during all of this, Brian Higgins heads back to the Canton Police Department. It is his day off that day, but he spends essentially the entirety of the day at the Canton Police Department. It is not clear from his testimony why he needed to be there. He was like paperwork and stuff. It's not clear. At this point, it is heavily snowing. Crime scene services has not been called. Even the CERT team has not been notified at this point. We are talking the snow is accumulating at a rate of about 1 to 2 inches per hour. At around 10 a.m., the Massachusetts State Police arrive at Canton Police Department. Yuri Buchanan, as well as Michael Proctor, go over to Canton PD, and then they head over to Good Samaritan Hospital to see what's going on. At 10:41 a.m., Buchanan calls the medical examiner, Dr. Scordy Bello, and he tells her that this might have been a domestic incident involving a cocktail glass. Because remember, the only thing that they have is the cocktail glass. They have not found a single one of the 47 taillight pieces. They collect John O'Keefe's clothing from Good Samaritan Hospital. They're like on the floor at the hospital because they've obviously cut them off of him to try to treat him as urgently as possible. They bag up his clothing, which is bloody and covered in vomit. They put those clothes in a plastic bag and they put them in the back of Buchanan's work vehicle. And then the two of them head out to go interview Jen McCabe and Matt McCabe. At about 11:30 that morning, the two of them go over to the McCabe residence. And not only are Jen McCabe and Matt McCabe there, but also Brian Albert is there. So they decide to interview all of them. None of these interviews are recorded. After Proctor interviews the McCabes and Brian Albert, he is texting his sister Courtney. As I told you guys, there's a conflict here because his sister is friends with Brian Albert's brother and his entire family. Michael Proctor says, just found a frozen to death on the front lawn in Canton. Actually just interviewed Jen McCabe. She said she knows you. So he knew from noon, the day that he was assigned to this case, that there was a conflict here. Courtney says, cut the shit. Yeah, she knows Jack very well. She's good friends with Julie Albert, Chris's wife. Her sister's married to Brian Albert. You still working? Clearly, Courtney knows these people. At around 1:20 in the afternoon, Michael Proctor calls Karen Reed from his personal phone. And just a few minutes later, Karen is searching and trying to find a DUI attorney because she's worried she's going to be arrested for drunk driving. Meanwhile, in a group chat featuring Matt McCabe, Jen McCabe, Nicole Albert, and Brian Albert, Matt McCabe is texting the group talking about Chris Albert and how him and Julie are going to be interviewed by the police. He says, tell them the guy never went in the house. The guy being John O'Keefe. Brian Albert says, exactly. Meanwhile, Proctor's still texting his sister to update her. Don't say a word to anyone. At the very least, it's suspicious. As you guys probably know, Michael Proctor was later fired, and part of it was these text messages where he was revealing information about the investigation to somebody not involved in the investigation, his sister. At this point, they had already decided that Karen Reed was guilty, essentially. Honestly, it's unclear to me if they even had a search warrant for the car or the phone, or if they used like exigent circumstances to take them. But Karen had gone over to her parents' house in the afternoon. They live in Dighton, which is like 40 minutes away from Canton. The blizzard, of course, it would be a longer drive. They called up Sergeant Nicholas Barros, who is a Dighton police officer, and they said, hey, we're coming to your area. We're going to come seize this car from Karen Reed. So Buchanan and Proctor go to Dighton, meet Barros there. A tow truck driver comes to assist, and they take possession of Karen Reed's vehicle. And I believe 9 different reports and affidavits Michael Proctor wrote that they took possession of the car at 5:30 p.m. But luckily, we have footage from, I believe, Karen's parents' Ring camera. That's what this is. Some kind of like home camera, showing that they actually took the car at 4:12 p.m. No police officer, the tow truck driver, nobody took a single photograph of the vehicle at Karen's parents' house. While Buchanan and Proctor are in Dighton getting the vehicle and Karen's phone. And remember, they've actually never been to the actual crime scene at this point. While all of that is happening, a CERT team is being gathered. CERT stands for Special Emergency Response Team. Typically, a CERT team is like search and rescue. They are not the crime scene people. There is a separate group called CSS, Crime Scene Services, and they would be the ones who would come out, do like a grid search, use GPS coordinates to locate where exactly they found pieces of evidence, take photos, etc. Absolutely none of that was done. In fact, the photographs we do have of the scene that day, they look like this, like they were taken on a flip phone. Here's another one. Like, this was taken in 2022. Why is every camera in Massachusetts also a potato? Dang, I meant to put Kevin O'Hara on this list also. Let me get a photo of him. Okay, this is Lieutenant Kevin O'Hara of the Massachusetts State Police, and he testified about the CERT team response. Just before 3 o'clock, they were notified that they were trying to figure out who was available to come in for this response, but they did not yet have the green light. He testified that they were not yet authorized to respond by 3 p.m. And And so O'Hara doesn't arrive at 34 Fairview until 4:56 p.m. During that time, of course, Buchanan and Proctor are with Karen's SUV traveling back to the Canton Police Department, because even though the Canton Police Department has recused themselves from this investigation, they decided to store Karen Reed's vehicle there. It arrives at 5:30 p.m. Last CERT team person arrives at 5:41 p.m. and the search begins. Canton Police Department is only a few minutes away from the Alberts residence, and that leaves a window of time where somebody could have brought a broken piece of Karen Reed's tail light from Canton Police Department to 34 Fairview. 3 taillight pieces were found that evening. There is no report that indicates at what time the pieces were found or exactly where on the property they were found. And O'Hara says that Tully is the one that told them where to search and that they were not directed to go search inside the house. After like half an hour, they stopped searching and everybody goes home. It isn't until 10 p.m. that evening that Proctor and Buchanan finally lay out John O'Keefe's clothing on butcher paper at the Norfolk District Attorney's Office. We'll have to continue this in part 4. Love you, drink water, Karen Reed recap part 4. I've put all the parts into its own playlist so you can catch up if you've missed any. When we left off, Buchanan and Proctor had just laid out John O'Keefe's clothing on butcher paper to dry in the district attorney's office. They had just spent the entire day driving around in Buchanan's car with John's blood and vomit-covered clothing soaking wet in a plastic bag in the back of his vehicle. But at around 10 p.m. that evening, they finally get a chance to lay everything out to dry, though they do not establish any kind of chain of custody log for this evidence or basically any other evidence in this case. A little while later, Michael Proctor starts texting his school friends. This is 16 hours into being assigned to this investigation, and these school friends are not fellow police officers. You can see he's sending the Facebook link to John's account, revealing that the homeowner is a Boston cop also, but not saying who it is. He says she waffled him, he was banged up, and right here he says she hit him with her car. And he continues to reveal information about the case, except for Brian Albert's name, and says serious charges will be brought on the girl. And then he speculates about whether or not she's hot. She's a babe with a weird Fall River accent though, no ass, 0 chance she skates, she's effed. All the powers that be want answers ASAP. The next day, on January 30th, Jen McCabe goes over to Michael Lank's house, along with Carrie Roberts, whose daughter apparently is friends with Michael Lank, according to a court filing. Jen says they were at the Lanks' house for like an hour, but no record of this meeting was ever made. And Jen had revealed this to Brian Tully, one of the Massachusetts State Police officers, as well as the Commonwealth, Adam Lally and Laura McLaughlin, who were the ADAs that were prosecuting Karen in the first trial. And none of these people revealed any of that to the defense until after Jen McCabe testified in Karen's first trial. On January 31st, the autopsy of John O'Keefe was completed, and the manner of his death was listed as undetermined. So they said that he died from multiple brain contusions, one to the front, one to the back, one to the side of the head, including a skull fracture that originated from the back of the head and spread forward. And there was also evidence of hypothermia because John was not dressed warmly. He was in like a thin long-sleeve shirt and jeans, and one of his shoes was missing. And John's right arm had some suspicious-looking scratches that looked a lot like bite marks from a German Shepherd. Otherwise, there were no broken bones, there was no real bruising, very minor contusion to his knee, to the back of his hand, really nothing else going on, no road rash, nothing like that. Michael Proctor had a group chat with a bunch of different Massachusetts State Police officers, and at one point he would text one of them, David DeChica, where they discussed how the ME wouldn't give them the determination of death as homicide. Michael Proctor says, "We laid out the entire case for her. Should have had me or Jeff do it. If you did it, she would have made it accidental or natural cause. Of course it was undetermined. She was a whack job." Proctor testified when he was talking about this, he wasn't talking about the ME, he was talking about Karen Reed. I don't believe that for a second. The next day, he's texting his school friends more stuff about Karen Reed, including disparaging things about her Crohn's disease. And he's also texting his sister about getting a present from Julie Albert. This is just a couple days after John died, and this man is still investigating this case. "I just saw Julie. She said when this is all over, she wants to get you a thank you gift." He says, "Get Elizabeth one instead." That's his wife. So he's still accepting the gift. It's just going through his wife. February 1st, the same day those texts are going around, Trooper Joe Paul goes to look at Karen Reed's car. Trooper Paul is from the Collision Analysis Reconstruction section of the Massachusetts State Police, also known as the CARS unit. He goes out to observe the Lexus. I believe Maureen Hartnett might have been there at the same time. It might have been the day after. But either way, while Trooper Paul was there, he observed glass on the bumper of the vehicle. Later, this glass would be tested, and it would be determined that it did not match the cocktail glass that was in John's hand, nor did it match any glass on the street. Also, it didn't match any other glass on the car. There was no glass on the car for it to match. It has been unclear to this day where that glass came from. And Maureen Hartnett collected one hair from the rear quarter panel. Somehow this hair was able to hang onto the side of the car through a hour-long drive through a blizzard, but it was tested and a match for John O'Keefe. February 2nd, Karen Reed was arraigned on manslaughter charges. They had not yet upgraded her to second-degree murder. That very same day, Karen Reed's defense team files an emergency preservation order for all physical evidence to do with this case, including video footage. Also on that day, David Yannetti, who is Karen Reed's main lawyer, he gets a tip from somebody who claims to be friends with Brian Albert. That tip says that Brian Albert and Colin Albert could possibly be involved, could possibly be suspects in John O'Keefe's death. At this point, David Yannetti had not heard of Colin Albert. He did not even know that Colin Albert was at the party. Around this time, Brian Higgins is interviewed. Higgins had contacted his ATF buddy Matt Kell, and the two of them had done a cell phone extraction on Brian Higgins' phone. Higgins selectively picked out communications that he wanted to present, and he handed those specific communications over only. That is how we have text messages from Higgins, even though he later destroyed his cell phone, but we'll get to that. While all of this is going on, random people are going over to 34 Fairview and finding pieces of tail light. On the 3rd of February, Michael Proctor goes over there and he finds some pieces of tail light. On the 4th, Kenneth Berkowitz, who's the chief of Canton PD, goes over there. He finds some tail light. Even though Canton Police Department, I'll remind y'all, is recused from this investigation at that point and should not be doing any looking for tail light. But still, they go back multiple times. I believe it was like the 8th, 11th, 17th, 18th. On all of these days, they find more pieces of tail light, including Michael Proctor finding some of the biggest pieces of tail light on the 18th of February, about a week after most of the snow had completely melted and the ground was bare. I think an easy way that they could prove their case is by using some Ring camera footage from the town. But allegedly, the people that live across the street from Brian Albert who have a Ring camera looked at their footage and said there was nothing of value and just didn't hand over any footage. Also, the library camera, the Canton Library camera, which recorded Karen Reed's SUV going towards 34 Fairview, was suspiciously missing the footage of Karen coming back from 34 Fairview. Also, when reviewing the Ring camera at John O'Keefe's house, David DeChico had left a note saying 12:41 a.m. taillights in driveway. But later it was said that there's no footage of Karen Reed returning to John O'Keefe's house. At one point, they kind of tried to accuse Karen Reed of deleting that footage, but it never made sense because John O'Keefe's phone was the only phone that had access to the Ring camera app. Remember John O'Keefe's clothing that's drying at the district attorney's office? 6 weeks after laying it out, on March 14th, they finally take the clothing over to the crime lab, and that is the first moment that a chain of custody log is established for that clothing. So for 6 weeks, it is deeply unclear who had access to it and what happened. A couple months later, in May of 2022, there's an incident with Chloe. Canton Animal Control officer writes a quarantine for Chloe after a skin-piercing incident. Within a couple weeks, she is rehomed to Vermont after having been the Alberts family dog for at least 3 or 4 years. I'm not exactly sure when they got her, but they have records from her from at least 2019. On the 9th of June, Karen Reed's charges are upgraded and she is indicted by a grand jury for second-degree murder. Her bail is set at $100,000 and she posts it. And in September, her legal team files a preservation order for a bunch of people's cell phones, including Brian Albert, Nicole Albert, I believe they already had Jen's phone, Matt McCabe, Julie Nagel, and Brian Higgins. On September 22nd, there was a pre-trial conference where they were arguing about this cell phone preservation order. And the judge ruled that they must preserve the cell phones pending a October 3rd hearing with Judge Cannoni, because this was in front of a different judge. At the September 22nd hearing, that was kind of the first time the defense really brought up that they believed that John O'Keefe was beaten up inside the house, possibly to do with Brian Albert, and they brought up Brian Albert's connection to various members of the police. Brian Albert testified on stand that that very same day he got rid of his phone. He went in and traded in his phone for a different phone. The judge didn't actually issue the ruling on preserving the phones until the next day, so technically he got in under the wire. Then on the 29th of September, Brian Higgins changes his cell phone provider as well as his phone number. And Judge Cannoni ultimately denied access to a lot of these people's cell phones. Later that month, Brian Higgins asks the Commonwealth, hey, is it cool if I go destroy my phone? And they give him the go-ahead. So Brian Higgins drives to a military base in Cape Cod, takes his SIM card out of his phone, cuts or destroys it, and then throws the phone away separately. He ended up speaking about all of this in a federal proffer. The U.S. District Attorney's Office was investigating the investigation into Karen Reed at this time still, and they interviewed Brian Higgins. And he said he and Brian Albert had discussed destroying their cell phones after Brian Albert got a text message that concerned him. In October, Proctor finally interviews Julie Nagel for the first time, and that's when she says that she saw a dark blob on the lawn. She had not mentioned this to anybody prior to this moment. Also in October, Cannoni granted a motion in part to compel all video evidence be produced for Karen Reed's legal team. They also were required to provide them all of the metadata associated with those videos. And in April of 2023, the defense finally learns about Jen McCabe having searched How Long to Die in Cole, potentially before they had found John's body and long before any 911 call was made. Over the next couple months in 2023, Proctor would interview Caitlin and Brian for the first time, Allie for the first time, Colin for the first time. None of these people were ever interviewed in 2022. Also lucky they didn't interview till 2023. In August 2023, the Norfolk DA Michael Morrissey releases a statement. He condemns harassment of these witnesses. He says that conspiracy theories are not evident. He says anything against these witnesses is baseless, which is wild because we now know that a lot of these witnesses are part of the third-party culprit defense. In February of 2024, the Commonwealth revealed that they had found touch DNA of John O'Keefe on Karen Read's car. This is not blood DNA. This is like skin cells and stuff that you would leave behind if you simply just touch something. Exactly what it sounds like. And then just a few days after that, they had to delay the entire trial because the federal government provided both the defense and the Commonwealth with over 3,000 pages of evidence from their investigation. And this would take them a long time to go through. That information included the reports from ARCA, which both the defense and Commonwealth had access to. I ran out of time. I'm only gonna have to make one more part. I'm gonna film it right now. You should be able to watch it in like an hour or two. Just bear with me, guys. We're so close. Love you guys. The fifth and final part of my Karen Read recap. We left off with both the defense and the Commonwealth getting over 3,000 pages of information from the federal government. This was, of course, after the federal government had done an investigation into the Massachusetts State Police handling of John O'Keefe's passing. The trial was moved back to April, and then on April 4th, the Commonwealth gave the defense the very first footage of the Canton Police Department. This footage, which did not include the inverted camera footage, by the way, was missing a 42-minute interval, which was right at the exact time that Karen Read's SUV would have entered the garage. This is really important because if they can prove that Karen Read's vehicle was not as damaged as the Commonwealth says it was, it gives the defense a lot of credibility to their theory that the taillight pieces were actually planted at 34 Fairview. Frankly, I don't even need that reasonable doubt. I've seen enough. So that footage was handed over on the 4th of April, and then on the 10th of April, the Commonwealth filed a certificate of compliance. They said that they had exercised reasonable inquiry and due diligence, and that to the best of their ability, they had disclosed and made all evidence available that was subject to discovery. But of course, we later learned that they had way more video footage to hand over. A week later, jury selection began on the 16th of April. And then on the 23rd of April, the Commonwealth produced the inverted Sally Port footage. Surely by this point, they had handed over all the footage that they had in their possession, right? On April 29th, the trial truly begins. This is when they deliver their opening statements. This is day one of the trial. The Commonwealth got to present their side first, and they had so much testimony from so many witnesses. But it was basically just all eyewitness testimony. It wasn't like, here's what actually happened for sure and here's the evidence of it. It was just eyewitnesses being like, this is what I saw, in my opinion at least. And then on May 10th, Jen McCabe meets with Brian Tully, as well as Adam Lally and Laura McLaughlin. This is the meeting where Jen McCabe reveals to them that on the 30th of January, she went over to Michael Lank's house. This information would not be revealed to the defense until May 29th, long after Jen McCabe had stepped down from the witness stand. Karen Read's legal team has filed a motion to dismiss the entire case against her for the second trial, and part of this motion has to do with the fact that they did not get this information about Jen McCabe meeting with Michael Lank before Jen McCabe testified. So when they cross-examined Jen McCabe, they could not impeach her testimony using that information. I have a ton of videos on what happened during the trial itself. I can't get into a lot of detail on it, or this would be a 17-part series. So we'll fast forward to the end of the trial, where the jury deliberates. I believe it was like 4 days total, maybe 3.5 days. It's all a blur. For the entirety of jury deliberations, or anytime there was a sidebar, anytime the cameras were cut in court and the audio was cut, the courtroom camera would pan to the fan, this fan over here on the left. For the entirety of the trial, the fan became a figure in the courtroom. We looked at it more than we looked at basically any witness. And then as we slowly descended into madness during the jury deliberation phase while we were waiting for the jury to come back with their result, the camera moved over and revealed that there was a second fan in the courtroom. And so my live stream named him Brian because statistically, Brian. Sorry for the tangent, we had to talk about the fans. On July 1st, 2024, Karen Read's trial ended in a mistrial. The foreman of the jury had given a note to Judge Cannoni 2 different times before this, saying that they were unable to come to an agreement on the charges, and Judge Cannoni had sent them back out to deliberate further 2 different times. The second time she sent them out, she read them what's called the Tui Rodriguez instructions. These are instructions for the jury that basically say, hey, you the jury are the best people on this planet to make this decision. You can do this. If there's reasonable doubt, find her not guilty. Now get out there and make a decision. And yet they still came back and they sent in another note saying, we're still deadlocked. Judge Cannoni read the note from the jury to herself first, then she brought in the jury. She never gave the defense or the Commonwealth a moment to read the note. She didn't tell them the content of the note. Then she read it aloud to the court and it said, we're at an impasse, essentially. After one single breath, Judge Cannoni dismissed the jury. She did not poll them. She did not ask what charges they were hung up on. I made this myself because I hated their verdict slip so much, but this way you can see what the charges were. She was charged with second-degree murder, manslaughter, as well as these 2 lesser included charges under manslaughter. So all these 3 middle ones count as 1 count, and then the third count is leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death. No part of the jury slip was ever filled out, and part of the reason for that is possibly because the jury instructions were so confusing from Judge Cannoni. She basically said, do not fill out any part of any form until you come to a conclusion on all of the charges. And so they just never filled in any part of the verdict slip. This became a huge deal after the first trial because the jury list was impounded, so there was like no way for anybody to ask any of these jurors what happened. But very quickly, jurors started coming forward of their own volition. I think it was 3 jurors came directly to Karen Reed's defense team, and then 2 more jurors came forward through an intermediary. They all said exactly the same thing, that they found Karen Reed not guilty of second-degree murder, as well as not guilty of leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death. That they were truly only hung up on those middle charges, the manslaughter and the 2 lesser charges. All of that has resulted in motions to dismiss, in a federal appeal. That appeal is still pending. Simultaneous to all of that happening, directly after the jury came back and said, sorry, we're at an impasse, like within hours, it was announced that Michael Proctor was being relieved of duty for his actions during the Karen Reed investigation. That was on July 1st, and then on July 8th, it was announced that he was going to be suspended without pay pending the result of a state board hearing. A little over a month later, Paul O'Keefe and other members of John O'Keefe's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Karen Reed. I believe they had 3 years to file any kind of civil suit that they wanted to file against anybody to do with John O'Keefe's passing, so they did get that lawsuit in under the wire. They're also suing C.F. McCarthy's as well as Waterfall Bar and Grill. Those are the 2 bars that Karen Reed went to before she went over to 34 Fairview with John. O'Keefe family is alleging that they overserved Karen Reed, and that all of that ultimately resulted in John's untimely death. That civil lawsuit is on hold until after Karen Reed's criminal trial is complete. The day after that civil suit was filed, Matthew Farwell was indicted for the murder of Sandra Birchmore. This is like an aside, but it is relevant. Several Massachusetts state police officers and Canton police officers that were involved in the investigation of John O'Keefe's death were also involved in investigating Sandra Birchmore's death. She was a 23-year-old pregnant woman who was killed by the alleged father of her child, a member of the Stoughton Police Department, Matthew Farwell. Trooper Nick Garino, who testified in Karen Reed's trial, said that he reviewed all the messages between their phones and he found no communications that were suspicious. Later, 30,000 communications appeared. Fanning, who was in the group chat with Michael Proctor, was part of this investigation, a major part of the investigation. Michael Lank was one of the first on scene. And Michael Morrissey, of course, the district attorney, is the one that declined to indict anybody for Sandra Birchmore's death. In fact, it was ruled to be self-inflicted. And for 3 years, she got no justice until the federal government stepped in and finally indicted Matthew Farwell. And multiple times, Sandra Birchmore's name has come up in the prep for Karen Reed's second trial, so I'm very curious if she's going to be mentioned in Karen Reed's second trial. Then, on October 10th, 2024, surprise, surprise, the Commonwealth produces even more footage of the Sally Port. This time it's video footage of Brian Higgins at 1:30 in the morning the night that John died, like an hour after John died, on the phone with somebody at the Canton Police Department. This had never been turned over to the defense before the trial. This was the first time the defense had ever heard anything about it. When they were asking where all of this video footage came from, some of the footage was found on, I guess, like a disc or a CD or a thumb drive or something that was in a paper file belonging to Michael Proctor. For a while, they kept calling it a paper file, as if it was just like somebody's random report somewhere and not the lead investigator of the case. And then there was also another police officer from the Canton PD who had retired and apparently had a bunch of this video footage on his personal hard drive or possibly iCloud. None of these are like original copies with the original metadata attached. There's a question of like how the quality is so bad on these cameras, and that footage has been a huge part of the defense's motion to dismiss. They're like, you basically withheld all of this stuff from us, even though on April 10th they had filed that certificate of compliance saying that they had handed over all discoverable evidence. Defense is like, but you were still in possession of it and didn't give it to us. The Canton PD, the Massachusetts State Police, investigating bodies count as an extension of the Commonwealth. They are all one thing. There is no like, oh, it's Michael Proctor's fault. We didn't know. He is an extension of the Commonwealth. Judge Cannoni has still not ruled on the motion to dismiss, but it is extremely obvious that she is going to deny it. The question is, will she allow an evidentiary hearing? Very unlikely. Not looking good for that either, and I feel like that is a miscarriage of justice personally. That's my personal opinion. Chief Berkowitz had retired already, but in December of last year, he did pass away. Any information that he knew is also gone as well. If you had any faith the Commonwealth was done handing over video footage, your faith is misplaced, because on the 28th of January this year, they produced even more footage of the Canton Police Department. Tomorrow is the last pretrial hearing, supposedly, before Karen Reed's second trial. Jury selection is set to start on April 1st. Several media outlets have reported that the jury pool could be upwards of 2,000 people, because while they can find people who have heard about Karen Reed's case, they have to also find people who don't have an opinion about what may have happened with John O'Keefe. So tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern, there's another hearing, and hopefully we get some rulings pretty quickly in some of the motions that were argued last week. And hopefully we get a ruling on the motion to dismiss as well. But that's it. That is the recap. I do have one singular correction. I said that John O'Keefe's niece and nephew were both home. The nephew was actually at a friend's house having a sleepover. So I'm sorry about that. If I got anything else wrong, please feel free to tell me. It is very hard to keep all this straight. Okay, I hope y'all appreciated this because it was extremely difficult to put together. I love you guys. Drink water. Bye.